Hello, 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 and welcome to this week's episode of Not D&D, brought to you by EM World. I am your host, Jessica, and this week, joining us from the other side of the world to where I am, in Australia, she woke up early to be here. Thank you so much for joining us, Robin Small.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be on the show.
Well, of course, thank you so much for getting up early. I hope you've had your coffee. To those watching live, we are live recording, so if you have any questions, please get involved in the chat. And if you're listening to the podcast later or catching up to the video later, because maybe you also live in Australia and are not awake yet, all the links to everything we're talking about will be in the show notes or up on the screen. But we're going to be talking about your game, Robin, Horse and Rider, which I was very excited to learn about. It's a gorgeous 2-player game, which has some really lovely mechanics that blend so nicely into the theme, but we'll talk about that a bit later, because if I may be a little bit nosy about you and your relationship with games, could you tell us about your first memory of playing a tabletop role-playing game?
I feel a bit silly admitting this, but I was very not very young, but I don't actually know the name of the first game I ever played. I was told at the time it was like a rules like D&D, but looking back,
Okay.
I doubt that. It was
yeah?
hosted by a friend's older sibling, and since then I've moved on a bit from whatever that was and D&D into more independent games. So yeah, that was probably my first memory of playing tabletop role-playing games.
Great. So there's like like you said, a friend's older siblings, so people around you were playing games. What sort of other games drew you in and got you interested in the hobby?
I think, like I said, I started with D&D, but what really got me interested in the hobby was a game called Monster Hearts 2.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's quite, it's had quite a bit of information about it online, and I ended up meeting a wonderful community there, and I started out writing playbooks for Monster Hearts 2, which sort of got me into further both different games. You know, realizing this was something I could do without having to worry about D&D's idea of balance, but also, you know, there are other ways to write a game other than Dungeons and Dragons, and other ways to play a game other than Dungeons and Dragons.
Absolutely. Well, on the show Not D&D, we very much agree with that. So great. So it sounded like you started playing like a homebrew version of D&D or whatever it was, and then moving into something a bit more indie with Monster Hearts. And you know, it sounds like you were already kind of designing a bit by making your own playbooks and playing about with things like that. What made you take the leap and want to make your own games?
It was actually playing a game called Owlbear, which is a hack of Honey Heist. It was my birthday and I was running it, and for some reason the players decided to abandon the quest in favor of unionizing against the wizard that they were supposed to be working for. And I thought this concept was hilarious, and that of course led to the creation of my first ever game, Down with the Bourgeoisie, because I just found the concept hilarious and I thought it could make a fun game. You know, what if we encouraged players everywhere to unionize against the GM on her birthday? So
I think that's a relatable experience for a lot of game masters as well, as the party just not doing the thing you have prepared and expected to do. So I'm sure we can empathize. Amazing. So tell you what, let's jump into talking about Horse and Rider, which is why we're here. So if people haven't heard of Horse and Rider before, could you give us a little introduction to what the game is?
So Horse and Rider is a two-player game, very heavily inspired by actual Australian horse breaking techniques. It follows the bond you form between the horse and the rider as the two learn to understand each other as a part of the horse being broken. You know, one thing that really fascinated me, I don't want to go off on a whole tangent, is that there's a whole focus in the community here in horse breaking of forming a bond rather than domination, and I wanted to explore that in a game. So yes, that's
perfect. I was so intrigued by the idea when I saw it, because I don't think I've looked at a game that looked at it in that way, because a lot of games that have relationships with animals is about like ownership and things like this, but this seemed to really be about that relationship building and the bond forming that you mentioned, and so many 2-player games focus on that. So I thought it's really interesting to not have it between two human or humanoid characters. So what were your inspirations to create this game?
There were, like I said, there were a lot of real life inspirations and a lot of real life people. My mum very heavily inspired this game. I say this with
Oh.
nothing but love towards her, but she is a bit of a horse girl.
Mm-hmm.
For the entire, like for a lot of her life and youth, she had a horse called Shadow, with whom very close. Like there are photos of her like putting me on him to ride as a baby.
No.
And it's so she had this amazing bond with this horse and a very deep understanding, which of course, like that's a very stereotypical horse girl trope, oh, she's the only one who can understand this, wild animal. And later on in life, we met this Tasmanian horseman who like actually breaks horses and owns a farm, which is where she is right now, actually. And it was fascinating getting to see his perspective on taming horses and how he trains them, how like is responding, because it really is a like mutual trust and partnership. Like it's for a trust with the horse, that the horse can trust you to lead it rather than dominion. It's about saying like, no, it's you can trust me, I'm not going to hurt you, and I'm going to make sure what happens is for the best for both of us. And having that trust with a horse can allow you to do so much more than just controlling it or trying to dominate it. Those were both big inspirations, and I think another, like I said, the horse girl element, the main mechanic is a braiding mechanic, which of course is influenced by my mom. Still has bits of Shadow's hair around the house, which she's braided into little bracelets and things, which I think is very sweet, personally.
Yeah. So how does the braiding mechanic work in the game? So I understand the concept and where we're coming from. We're playing the horse and the rider. How do we sit down to play?
There are two different ways to play the game. One of them is designed for newer role players who aren't as maybe familiar with the idea of just having roleplay be more of a combat between two people. So there is an optional dice mechanic, but the way the main mechanic works is that the horse marks whether they've lost or gained trust based on how many braids they add or remove to the plat, for lack of a better word. So, for example, if the rider is something that frightens the horse, they might remove a couple of braids. And when the rider thinks that they've gotten enough of the braid done, the horse trusts them enough to move on to the next stage. They'll try to initiate that verbally, and it's really the braid is really the main way that the horse has to communicate with the rider that this is something I'm okay with, or this is something I'm not okay with, like when I'm ready to move on. Because in real life, horses cannot talk, so the only way we really have is on what the work with them and how they've responded to that.
So with a 2-player game, a lot of the ones I'm familiar with have a bit of a tight kind of structure for how we play. Is that similar in Horse and Rider?
Yes, yes, there is. There is a 6 just to the game again. Australian horse breaking techniques, in which it's generally broken down into 6 stages you can attempt to ride. And much like that, there's 6 stages that the horse and rider need to move through in order to get to that point where they feel where the rider feels and the horse feels that they're both comfortable enough with each other to sort of attempt to ride, even if it's just getting on the horse's back for a couple of minutes, rather than just jumping straight on the horse and getting thrown.
Absolutely.
Yes, to answer your question, there are 6 stages.
Fab, great. So when we I love the idea of the braiding mechanic because that seemed really unique to me. And the game also uses dice as well. So what other mechanics are involved when we sit down to play?
Like I said, it's the main might be optional. But aside from that, there isn't really all that much. The game is designed to be very focused on the interactions between the horse and the rider, and also I think in many ways that having all these additional things make it a bit harder to pick up. I think it can be a bit daunting, especially if you're taking a chance on a new game. to like purchase all these new die potentially, or like if you're, especially if you're new to the genre, like having to pick up like what's a I'm sure most people know what a D20 is, but, they might not be familiar with the minutiae and the language. So I've tried to make it so that it doesn't require all that much.
Wonderful. So that's a real accessibility choice for you, I suppose, for new players. And you talked a lot about accessibility, I noticed on your campaign and things you wanted to do. So when we use I know accessibility can be a bit of a buzzword, but what did it mean for you in creating Horse and Rider?
Well, sorry, I don't. Horse and Rider is a game that I think a lot of people should be able to play. I'm aware that it sounds a bit arrogant now that I've actually verbalized it, but I think in general it's important for with different needs to be able to access games. I think it's important for people who I think it's a wonderful hobby. You can learn so much from tabletop role playing games. You can make some really close friends, and I think a lot of people should be able to enjoy the hobby regardless of any disability they have. And I think if I can help with that, if I can make my games a little more accessible for people, I think that's something I should at least try to do rather than. And I think it's important as a community that we try to be as inclusive as possible in our work. Excuse me.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. I really think that's great. And I think when you're making a game, especially as a smaller publisher, it's sometimes there's so much to do and it can be quite overwhelming. So taking the time to think about those things, I think is really great, because I think when we see bigger publishers, like they have teams of people doing stuff. And I think sometimes people forget, usually in smaller games, it's kind of a lot of the time one, maybe two people, making a thing together that they're really passionate about. So I think that's great that you had so much of that in the heart of the game. So talking about the game, what sort of stories are we going to be telling? So if somebody's not very familiar with horses and breaking in horses and what that means, could you give like an overview of the kind of the stories and interactions that the two players would have?
Well, there are a lot of different options. During the playtests, it doesn't necessarily have to be a horse and a rider. I think during the playtests, a couple of the players decided that they wanted to be a Florida man and a crocodile, and so the bond being formed wasn't between horse and rider. It was between crocodile and Florida man who wanted to really ride a crocodile. That didn't end very well for him. But I think it kind of shows there can be some variety in the stories told. It doesn't necessarily have to be a somewhat Western setting. It can be a fantasy one. It can be a sci-fi one. I think also if you're less familiar with horsebreaking, which understandable, not a lot of people are, there is a guide at the back half of the book to the different stages of horsebreaking based on the work Through the Guise of the Horse by Carlos Sorry, I always get this wrong. Carlos Taberna. Excuse me. Through the Guise of the Horse by Tanabelli. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry.
No worries. It's written in the book, so we can read it actually,
there. Yeah. Yes, I'm very sorry. It contains examples of different examples. It contains examples of different things you might in different stages of horsebreaking. It's designed. It is very much designed for people who aren't familiar with horsebreaking in mind, because the people who are familiar with horsebreaking, they're a very niche group, and I imagine. And I wanted to introduce this idea of horsebreaking, and not necessarily as domination, but rather as a bond being formed, because I think that's a fun idea. I think it's a fun idea.
Absolutely. And clearly other people did as well, because you did a crowdfunding last year, which successfully funded, and you've sent out the copies and fulfilled them. So that all happened last year. So the game exists and is out in the wild, as it were. So if people have been listening and they're interested in picking up a copy, how's the best way for them to do that?
I actually just sent a fresh, I guess, batch, for lack of a better word, there is a better word. I'm sorry, I've just woken up to Indie Press Revolution. So that's an indie sort of sales site where you can purchase it. I also have an itch.io, Small Red Robin 13, where you can purchase it. You can purchase a digital copy, and I also have all my other games on there. So if that appeals at all, and if you want to check out this game, it really. There's also a bunch of other cool stuff on there. If at the risk of sounding a little biased,
No, you're here. Talk about your games. You have to when you get the chance as an indie publisher. One thing I noticed you've done as well with the game is there is a system reference document. So could you talk a bit about what that enables people to do and why you chose to open up the game like that?
So a systems reference document is basically a way for people to make their own versions of the game. It's how do I put this? It contains just a basic overview of how each mechanic works. It's designed for people to also have the opportunity, the game designer's blessing, to try out and make their own version. It also comes with a little like tag which you put up on screen that basically says, hey, this is, a hack of X of a horse and rider that you can put up there, both to sort of show your work and give credit and to show like what your game's kind of all about, the mechanics people might encounter. The decision to make a systems reference document was kind of brought about as a result of a negative experience I had. Want to go into detail here, but I probably should. But effectively, after that I got into a conversation with a friend, and she was like, "That guy doesn't know what he's talking about. I could do that so much better, and I think your game could actually work in this way. Like, you should make." And I was like, "Oh, that's a really interesting way to view it. Like, I'd like to see what other people can do with the mechanics of the game and how it works, and see what other people do with it." Because I think giving people that opportunity to sort of take something and remix it a little is really within the spirit of creativity and spirit of collaboration. I think is so important in any creative industry.
Absolutely, I agree as well. And also it's great to hear that maybe if people have some more interesting stories, because I hadn't thought about not doing a horse and a rider, so we could see a Florida man and the crocodile version of this out in the wild to play if people really wanted, I guess. Yeah. Were there any other
ultimately it works for any...
Oh, sorry. I'll let you speak.
Oh, excuse me. Sorry. No, I'm sorry. I should let you... I just wanted to say, I think it works for any game where you want to show the forming of a bond between two groups. Like, that's really at its core what Horse and Rider is about. But I'm sorry, I shouldn't have cut you off.
No, I just think I have a little bit of lag, so I apologize for talking over you. Don't worry. I was just saying. So you mentioned the Florida man and the crocodile one. Were there any other like weird things in playtesting that came up that you maybe didn't expect? And that doesn't have to be like the creative idea, but maybe just the way the game changed from when you first wrote it through to playtesting it to the final version.
One of the things my original plan was to represent the horse and rider like bond with just a regular die, like having someone gonna die is the side. But while I was playing it with my mum, I saw she was, because I got her to playtest because of course I did. I saw she was struggling a bit with it, so that definitely made me kind of go back to the drawing board and be like, okay, this isn't working. I want to find something that's a bit more unique and also something that is maybe a bit more accessible for people who as familiar with tabletop role-playing games. So that was a very big influence. I also I sat, like I said, I didn't say this before, excuse me, I sat down with Tasmanian horseman I mentioned earlier and sort of interviewed him in more detail about different horse breaking techniques at multiple times throughout the sort of writing process. And also I couldn't actually find a copy of Through the Eyes of the Horse at first, so naturally that made it a bit difficult to write at first. And so it wasn't until much later on where I was finally able to track down a copy and get it ordered to me that I was able to sort of implement some more details about each of the 6 stages and some of the ways in which why some of the reasons that we have those different techniques and why we use them.
Beautiful. So this game sounds like a really nice way, like you say, to explore relationships between two beings. I'm so used to saying people, but no, not necessarily people, two beings. And like you say, it's got the structured stages. It's an introduction to, you know, if you're interested in horses but are not familiar with the world of what breaking them in means, it's also an introduction to that. So thank you so much for creating and sharing that with us. We're coming up near to the kind of end of our time on the stream today, but one thing I did want to ask, which I ask everybody, is if you have any other games that you'd like to recommend. And these can be the rules are, it can't be a game that you've made, and it can't be Dungeons and Dragons, obviously.
I think, of course, I'd have to recommend Owlbear, which was the game that inspired my first ever proper TTRPG. I think it's play Owlbears. It's a hack of Honey Heist. I think that's very fun. I'm just taking a moment to glance over at my game shelf, and probably Apocalypse World. I know that's a very popular game, relatively, but I think it really did. There's a reason it's so popular, and there's a reason there are so many powered by the Apocalypse games. I think it's a wonderful system, particularly if you're into post-apocalyptic, and it's very many different ways. So those would recommendations.
That's great. Thank you so much. And you're not the first game designer that's mentioned Apocalypse World as well. I think it's very popular with game designers because of its design approach. It makes it really accessible to pick and do your own thing with it. So I think it itches the brain of a lot of designers. Well, Robin, thank you so much for coming on and waking up early to share Horse and Rider with me and everybody that's watched or listened. As we mentioned before, if you're at all interested, please go pick up a copy, take a look, because the best way to support indie tabletop RPG creators is to buy their stuff. As we mentioned, the PDF is on itch, the links on the screen are in the show notes, and the physical copies are going to Indie Press Revolution. So you can check out those links there to pick up your copy of Horse and Rider. Thank you to everybody who came, watched and listens. We'll be back next week. We're looking at the Era D10 games, which embarrassingly, when I recorded, I referred to as Era D20 in the first minute. So enjoy that. We'll be back same time, same place next week. And yeah, Robin, thank you so much for coming on again. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you so much for having me on. And lovely to meet you. Bye.
Bye.